Greetings. In this tutorial, we are going to learn how to draw a project network diagram. We will see a couple of demonstrations and we will review some of the theory about project network diagrams. So let's get started. So in essence, project network diagram is a flow chart which is used to depict project sequence. So in this illustration, you can see the logical order of how different activities will be performed. So we are starting the project with first activity. Then after completing activity A, there are two parallel activities which are going on, and then after completion of activity B and C, we are beginning work on D, and after completing D, we are beginning work on activity E. So this way, this flow chart depicts the sequence of different activities. Right, so let's solve a simple problem to understand how project and networks are drawn. So in this problem, three tasks are required. Firstly, drawing a project network. Secondly, identification of burst activities. And thirdly, identification of merge activities. Right, so let's look at the problem. So different activities are shown and their precedence order is given here. So you can see the first activity is surveying a site which has got no predecessor, so it's clear that this is the first activity. Then this is followed by activity B, which has a dependence on activity A. So let's start by drawing a project network diagram. So here the first activity, as you can see, is activity A, and it has got no predecessor. Activity B, which is installing the drainage, depends on completion of activity A. So this would mean that activity B would follow activity A. Activity C also depends on completion of activity A. Activity D, which is excavation of sites, require completion of both activities B and C. So we would plot D here, and the last activity is activity E, which is dependent on activity D. Right, so here is another very clear illustration of the same problem, and you can see the network diagram illustrating various logical constraints that must be addressed for completion of this project. Now, another question asked was to identify the burst and the merge activities. So you can see activity A is bursting into two separate activities. So activity A will be an example of a burst activity within this network, whereas activity D is leading to a merger of activity B and C. So D would be referred to as a merge activity, and we will review this concept in the later slides. Right, so let's here. Same problem as before. You're expected to draw a project network diagram, identify burst activities and the merge activities. So if you're watching this video, you could pause at this stage and try to do it on your using your pen and paper. So here you can see different activities with the identification shown in this, the description of activities given here, and the predecessor in the last column. So if we have to draw the network, we could see the very first activity here is activity A, and activity B depends on activity completion of activity A. Activity C depends on completion of activity B. And then we look at activity D, which depends on activity C. Activity E also depends on activity C, and activity F also depends on activity C, and the last activity is activity G, which is reliant on completion of D, E, and F. So that is the last activity. Now another question asked was which one is the burst activity. So here we could see activity C is bursting into three different activities. So this will be an example of a burst activity. whereas activity G is leading to a merger of three different activities. So activity G will be an example of a merge activity. So here is a more clear illustration of this, where burst activity C is shown here, whereas the merge activity G is indicated here. Right, so project network diagrams. Why do we need these network diagrams? They provide the basis for scheduling labor and equipment. So we could load this network diagram with our time data and the labor requirements, and it could provide a valid basis for scheduling our labor and equipment. It enhances communication among project participants. It allows you to have a good bird's eye view of the overall project. Thirdly, it could lead to estimation of project duration and monitoring using critical path analysis, which we will be covering in the following video tutorials, and it provides a very valid basis for budgeting and cash flows. And also it leads to identification of critical activities. So critical activities are those where we have got no float or slack, and these are the activities that must be delivered on time to ensure that the project meets its schedule and date. Right, so let's review some of the project network diagrams. So the first step is that the network always flow from left to right. So as you can see, we draw it from left to right. Secondly, activities begins after preceding connected activities finish. So for instance, here excavation of site could only begin once installing of drainage and the installing the power lines have been completed. The arrows indicate the precedence and the flow relationship. So basically this arrow indicates that activity B could only commence once activity A has finished. Looping is not allowed, like some other flow chart notations. Conditional statements are not allowed within a network diagram, and we use common stop and start nodes.